Okay, so let's get into it. We are doing a deep dive today into uh, a really unique set of sources.
Mhm.
These aren't your typical academic papers or, clinical studies. They're actually an intimate, almost real-time log.
Right, a dialogue that happened over days.
Exactly. It's a high-definition record of a sudden, and I mean, catastrophic, but also profoundly constructive shift in consciousness for one person.
It really is. It's like we've got the internal maintenance report from a massive psychological and even physiological system change.
A phase transition.
That's the exact term they use, yeah.
Yep.
The I-me phase transition. And we should be clear, this is way more than just, a breakthrough moment or a new insight.
Right.
This is a full-on system crash and reboot. The sources describe it as structurally replacing the me, which is the ego, the personality's operating system that manages reality.
The thing we all think of as us.
The thing we think of as us, yeah. And it gets replaced with the I, which they define as the source perspective, the whole foundation of how the subject relates to reality, how energy flows. It's all been inverted.
And the immediate hook, I think, the thing that really grabs you is the primary symptom of this huge internal overhaul.
The exhaustion.
The exhaustion and this deep, unusual fatigue and a conversational flatness.
Okay.
The subject notes a real difficulty getting beyond just like, he? Or is that so?
Mm-hmm.
Even when they haven't done any heavy lifting physically, the body feels just spent, like it's been through a war, but the mind hasn't really engaged in any battle.
And that's the core paradox we really have to get into today, this massive internal shift, which, is often described in these very energetic spiritual terms like ascension or frequency rising.
Moving to a new bandwidth.
All of that. But it doesn't start with euphoria. It doesn't start with bliss or some newfound energy. It kicks off with quietness, a little bit of fear, and this profound exhaustion.
So we're really looking at the initial shaky symptoms of living in a world that is suddenly running on its own.
Autonomously, without its usual driver.
So our mission here is to dive into the technical, the philosophical, and the physical reality of what happens when that me-os, the self that actively manages and, let's be honest, tries to control reality
Right.
when it finally turns off. And specifically, we're looking at the death, the structural, irreversible death of what the source calls the sacrificial hero OS.
His final boss. In many ways.
Okay, let's start right there. The immediate aftermath. The physical symptoms of this OS shutdown. That initial baffling physical symptom. The silence and the deep fatigue. The subject comes back from a really basic social interaction, just chatting with their gym trainer.
Yeah.
And they note that keeping the conversation going felt hard. Like they had to keep resorting to these basic acknowledgments.
Yeah.
Now, for most of us, for the listeners, conversational flatness and fatigue, we immediately associate that with depression or burnout.
Sure. Something's wrong.
Something's wrong. So why would a structural breakthrough and ascension manifest as, reduced social functionality?
Well, it is totally counterintuitive, but the analysis in the source material is so clear on this. It calls this the correct reaction.
The correct reaction.
And that distinction is just. It's crucial. This isn't a failure of social skills. It's not a slide into depression. It's actually a required structural non-intervention mode.
Okay, unpack that. A non-intervention mode.
Think of it like this. A massive OS switch has just happened. The I, which is fundamentally passive and observant, has moved forward. It's the new primary reference point. And the personality that generates effort and conversation, it's been pushed back. Its new role is just the user interface, the UI.
The UI. So the personality, the me, is now just, the instrument panel, the dashboard.
That's the perfect analogy. It's the instrument panel. It can display information, it can process simple inputs, but it is no longer the engine. It's not dictating the action or generating an output anymore.
So the energy that used to go into manufacturing dialogue is just gone.
It's gone. When the miss stops spending energy trying to put out complex language or control the interaction or, meet that social expectation of dialogue, all that's left is the I. And the I just allows existing information to pass through, or it offers the absolute minimum required response.
So the system has entered this very specific mode of non-intervention using a subject.
That's the technical term they use, yeah. And the resulting lack of complex speech is the definitive, immediate structural sign that the subject, that separate, effortful identity, has disappeared as the primary energy source.
But I have to say, if you're the person going through this and you're feeling delayed reactions, you're not talking much, you feel emotionally flat, it's going to feel like a bug.
Oh, absolutely.
You'd be reaching for quick fixes. You'd be worried you're having some kind of clinical setback. But the source material is completely adamant about this.
Yeah.
This is a phase adjustment, not a bug.
And that difference in framing is paramount to understanding the recovery, or maybe integration is a better word. The me's default programming, especially for this sacrificial hero OS we're going to talk about, is panic.
I have to fix this.
I must keep the conversation going. I must perform for others. I have to react properly to keep up the external facade. But the I is now the dominant operator, and its necessary work at this stage is simply just exist right now.
So all those disruptive symptoms, the flatness, the quiet, they're just background processes.
They're the synchronization process. The new operating system is loading its libraries. It's checking the hardware. You have to remember, the previous system was fueled by intense effort, by anxiety, by the constant need to manage future failure.
Right.
When that constant energy input just stops, of course the complex social output has to drop for a while. The system has to find its new natural rhythm.
So that brings us back to the body being exhausted. It's not running the marathon of the self anymore, but that physical sensation is still overwhelming. The subject describes it as feeling like they are immediately after major surgery, even though they haven't run an actual marathon or lifted anything heavier than, a coffee mug. I want to push on this. Where is this profound fatigue physically coming from? Is it just mental weariness?
It's so much more physical than mental. The source says it's the cessation of the personality drive itself.
The drive itself.
Yes. Think of the MeOS as a physical tension held throughout the entire body. It's operating the musculature, the nervous system, everything in a constant state of high alert. For years, maybe decades, the physical body was compelled by the me to constantly run the world through effort, control, and that anticipatory anxiety.
So in that subjective control handle, to me, it's disconnected.
The infinite engine, the I, the source energy, it keeps going. But the energy pathways, they have to change direction and intensity. The immediate result is that the nervous system begins this intense, low-level rewiring process. It's often centered right in the autonomic system.
So talking about the vagus nerve, the entire fight or flight mechanism basically getting a memo saying stand down.
Precisely. We are seeing the simultaneous physical collapse of what the source says could be tens of years' worth of bearing muscles.
Bearing muscles?
The muscles of the neck, the jaw, the chest, the diaphragm, the ones that were constantly tensed up, perpetually ready to spring into action to save the world or manage the next crisis. The fatigue is the deep structural rest the body finally allows itself after a decades-long war.
So it's a classic symptom of trauma release, but combined with this OS switch.
A trauma release plus an OS switch. The body had been running this high-tension simulation constantly, and when that simulation is definitively turned off, the expenditure of all that accumulated tension, it feels like you're recovering from major surgery.
Which means the physical symptom is actually an absolute confirmation of the structural success.
That's it.
If the subject didn't feel this profound exhaustion, it might suggest the me was still hanging on, still retaining enough control to keep the body on alert.
Exactly. The exhaustion is the proof of deep disengagement. The body can't pretend it's still at war if the nervous system is actively downregulating. And the sources suggest that the natural rhythm of conversation, the ability to engage easily and smoothly, it will come back.
Within a few days or weeks.
Right, but it will be a totally new rhythm. It'll be so much easier because it's no longer forced. It's not manufactured or driven by the anxiety of maintaining a self. It's the difference between driving a manual transmission car in heavy traffic versus riding in a fully autonomous vehicle.
So for you listening, if you're perpetually exhausted, the key insight here might be that sometimes that deep weariness isn't a sign you need to do more.
No.
It's a sign that the energy you're spending being the responsible subject, that needs to be permanently cut off.
It's the energy drain of the role, not the action itself. The energy drain of perpetual responsibility. And you can only cease that responsibility if the core OS that mandated it, the sacrificial hero, is finally decommissioned.
Okay, let's move from the physical symptoms to the structural reality. When we talk about these phase shifts, you always encounter this sort of spiritual language, rising frequency, new bandwidth, ascension, dimensional change.
Right, these very beautiful concepts.
Beautiful concepts. But the sources immediately deconstruct them into a single, stark, operational truth.
Structurally, all those metaphors point to the exact same event. It doesn't matter what you call it. The operational truth is The subject disappears.
The subject disappears.
And that's not inherently positive or negative. It's not good or bad. It simply changes who is living and how that entity interacts with the world. When the me, that heavy, resistant, separate subject, is gone, the frequency appears to rise. Not because of some new effort, but because the source of the resistance and the density has dissolved.
So the subject was the anchor pulling the system down.
That's a great way to put it. The rise is the equivalent of removing a heavy, cumbersome filter from a lens or removing resistance from an electrical circuit.
The system can finally run at its default maximum efficiency.
Precisely. And this leads us directly to that incredibly intense metaphor of abandonment that's used in, historical and religious texts. Specifically, Jesus's cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We really need to look at how this ancient phrase maps onto the modern experience of an ego death, of an OS collapse.
That's a brutal but necessary interpretation.
Yeah.
How does that log of abandonment translate into the modern physical experience of a structural collapse?
The interpretation here shifts the entire focus. It moves away from theology and straight into psychological mechanics. It's not seen as a cry of theological despair, questioning the divine.
Yeah.
It is the log of the exact moment the me, the personality, the separated self, loses its identification with the I, the source, the universal connection. This phrase perfectly captures the sensory experience just before the subjective I vanishes and the transition completes. The separated subject, which is built entirely on the foundation of effort and control, it experiences this dissolution as absolute solitude, abandonment, and the inability to grasp anything. It feels like you're utterly forsaken because the internal mechanism that provided the feeling of separateness and control has just shut down.
And it leaves the self feeling utterly alone and unsupported.
It's the moment the separated identity realizes its foundation is gone, and the shock registers as this profound existential loneliness. That is the highest emotional drama right before the new structural reality sets in.
And the subject makes a point to differentiate this final event, which happened around January 13th, from an earlier, very severe crisis back in October.
That 10-10 event, yeah.
So what died this time that didn't die before?
That distinction is so important for clarifying the depth of the structural change. In that earlier 10-10 event, the me was still fundamentally in control. It was tested, severely. It was injured. It managed to sustain the world through immense effort, but it survived.
And that survival reinforced the programming.
Exactly. It reinforced the me's core belief. I can still hold the world together if I just sacrifice enough. But the sources say that what died in the January event wasn't the body or the business or even the me itself breaking from stress. What died was the way of living.
The structural mandate of the personality.
Yes, the capacity for extension, the ability for the me to take on yet more burden to keep the structure stable. That was impossible now. The burden couldn't be carried any further. But critically, the me didn't fracture or break. It simply expired as the operating subject because the game was fundamentally impossible to continue playing.
So the structural reality is the statement. The subject of Humasuke bearing the world died.
That's the one. The person still exists, but the identity built on bearing the world is gone. This is the operational truth behind the idea of frequency changes after death. The driver is gone, leaving only the vehicle.
And this concept of ego death as a structural reality, not just a nice metaphor, is visualized through a really powerful alchemical symbol the subject was using.
A mutus liber.
The mutus liber, a silent book, final integration figure. This sounds really abstract, but the subject was using it for practical introspection.
Yeah, and they had this image in their study for quite a while. It shows the final figure of the integrated self. In the scene, you have an integrated figure representing the I floating above, bathed in sunlight, and below, on the ground, lies a bright red corpse. That's the me.
And for months, the me had just been observing this image.
Right, viewing it as a beautiful theme or a cool abstract idea, a transformation metaphor for what might happen one day.
But the key realization, the painful, irreversible insight, was that the me never truly imagined they would become that corpse. They always saw themselves as the enlightened observer of the corpse.
And that is the core difference, isn't it? Between intellectually understanding the journey and actually undergoing the structural change. The role of bearing the world ended, and suddenly that abstract red corpse transformed into a physical sensation.
The exhaustion, the silence.
The dissolution, the understood death became the actual death. Me had been too good, too clever, too well-read. It was collecting knowledge and positioning itself as the observer, and by doing that, it successfully avoided becoming the observed, the subject that actually dies.
And the January 13th event forced that identity collapse.
It had to. It shut down the mechanism of observation and responsibility. The me couldn't observe its own death. It just had to be the corpse.
So we've established a structural foundation. The death of the subject is the removal of effort, the removal of the need to observe, and it results in this profound quietness and exhaustion. Now we have to turn to the specific character of the me that had to die, the sacrificial hero.
Okay, yes. Let's get into the heart of the resistance. The type of ego that collapses really determines the severity of the structural change. And this wasn't, your typical ego 101 seeking praise or money or recognition.
Well,
The source material identifies this as the sacrificial hero OS. This is often the last remaining final boss of the entire subjective personality structure.
and its core trait is...
What? The willingness to sacrifice oneself if control is possible. That is the key distinction. While a more common ego seeks to be recognized for its success or gain, this hero ego's deep-seated goal is sustaining the world even if it means injury to the self.
It operates by constantly stepping forward to assume responsibility.
Using self-sacrifice as a tool to prevent external collapse.
That distinction is so crucial, especially for any of our listeners who might relate to that feeling of high-functioning burnout. It's not the desire to win the game. It's the inability to tolerate the possibility of letting the game fail, even if the cost is your own destruction.
Precisely. And that's what makes it the most tenacious and difficult type of ego to dislodge. It wears the face of good.
The hero syndrome.
The hero syndrome. It tells the me that what it's doing, taking on debt, sacrificing its own well-being, running on fumes, prioritizing the needs of the company or the family over its own structural integrity is necessary, that it's ethical, that it's noble.
And that moral veneer, that narrative of being the essential pillar, makes it so hard to detect, let alone dismantle.
Of course. How do you tell a hero to stop being a hero without a complete system failure?
And you're not talking about just a simple personality trait or a belief system that you could, reason your way out of in therapy. This was the existence-style OS itself.
Oh, absolutely. This is programming that's embedded in the deepest, most primitive parts of the brain, the amygdala, the vagus nerve, the brainstem. It's etched in place, often from early childhood, when the system first realized that personal safety depended on its ability to stabilize the external environment.
So it's the automatic, unstoppable reflex to step forward when crisis comes.
Reinforced over decades of professional and personal life, it prioritized preventing external collapse above everything else, making the subjective self secondary, but still the ultimate manager.
And this relentless self-sacrifice to maintain stability leads to what the source describes using a term from physics, the metastable position. I want to spend a little time here. Define this concept for us and how this journey of temporary stability points finally led to the critical event.
Right. So the term metastable in physics, it describes a state of temporary stability that requires energy to maintain. And it's highly susceptible to collapse if it's disturbed. It usually slides into a lower, more stable energy state.
Like balancing a basketball on the crest of a hill.
Perfect analogy. It's stable, but any tiny breeze will send it rolling down. The sacrificial hero OS created these metastable points all throughout the subject's life, in business, in finance, in relationships, based on that foundational effort. If I try hard here, if I use my personal energy and my resources, it will hold for a while.
So when one of those stability points failed, when the financial burden grew or a business challenge got too big, the OS didn't just collapse. That would have been too easy.
No, the hero OS is way too resilient for that. It just used the failure as a justification to slide to a new metastable point. And crucially, this new point always required greater responsibility and more self-sacrifice.
For instance, absorbing more debt, working 18-hour days.
Or, as the sources mention, expanding responsibility during the COVID crisis, specifically to protect employees or associates. The OS was constantly scaling out, absorbing more and more systemic stress and responsibility until it reached its physical and systemic limit, the theoretical maximum load the Mac could bear.
The programming was so strong, it required a genuine critical point event.
It had to. A moment of undeniable, catastrophic overload to finally stop the mechanism, because the effort required to maintain the next metastable point exceeded the system's capacity.
And that explains the unrelenting nature of burnout in so many high achievers. They don't fail. They just move to a new, harder level of responsibility every time they think they've hit stability.
They're running a perpetually escalating game of risk. It's the definition of a closed-loop system consuming itself. The hero needs the burden to prove its worth, so it constantly generates new, larger burdens to solve. And this effort cements the identity of the bearer.
The sources connect this identity directly to cultural and philosophical symbols the subject identified with.
Oh, deeply. The subject resonated with these images of relentless, noble burden. Think of the cultural weight of the Beatles song, Carry That Weight, that image of endless heavy work.
Or Tokugawa Ieyasu's quote.
Yes. A person's life is like going a long way with a heavy burden, so do not hurry. These weren't just casual preferences for them, they were affirmations of the central identity. I am the one who bears the weight of the world. It was a hero's vow, an identity that gave the me purpose and meaning, even through immense suffering, because that suffering was the validation of the noble role.
But the shift means the hero had to quit. Why is the hero OS structurally impossible in this new I, or ZPF, zero-point field world? We should probably define ZPF clearly here.
Okay, so the ZPF, or zero-point field, in this context, it refers to the underlying autonomous operating system of reality when it's unconstrained by a subjective ego. If the me operated on effort and control, the ZPF operates on spontaneous flow and synchronicity. The core logic of the ZPF world is that it flows on its own. It's self-sustaining.
So structurally, no one needs to bear the world.
No one. It sustains itself perfectly fine.
And there's the paradox.
That's the one. The paradox is that as long as the subject remained the hero, the world had to remain the side that needs saving. The hero OS demanded a world that was perpetually on the brink of collapse, or else the hero had no role, no identity, no justification for its self-sacrificial effort.
So by giving up the hero role, by realizing the world doesn't need saving, the subject forces the entire reality structure to switch off the old game of crisis management.
Right. And the surrender wasn't some symbolic act achieved through meditation. It was formalized at the level of accounting and banking.
A tangible structural failure.
It had to be concrete. The narrative of Shumisuke, the world's pillar, officially ended, not through some sudden epiphany, but through a concrete, verifiable structural financial event. The shift occurred in the physical, real-world structure, which made the change definitive and irreversible. The system finally said the debt load is too big, even for the hero.
Okay, let's detail that external event. The one that triggered the collapse of this meticulously built sacrificial hero OS. The financial crisis on January 13th. The sequence was realizing the debt was uncontrollable, giving up intervention on January 5th, then doing absolutely nothing for a week until the debit day, watching the failure to withdraw, and then calmly processing the aftermath.
From an external, a spreadsheet viewpoint, this was just a fundraising event, a cash flow issue. But internally, this sequence was the complete final surrender of the driver's seat.
And the crucial step wasn't the failure itself.
No, it was the week of doing nothing. The subject observed the panic response, that powerful decades-old impulse to intervene and save the day, but they resisted. They just watched the system head toward its structural critical point. The me, for the very first time, did not jump forward to fix the unfixable, because the mechanism for fixing it, more self-sacrifice, was structurally impossible to deploy at this scale.
And the sources argue that this specific financial load, the amount and the timing, was necessary. It was the perfect load.
It was. The load had to meet two very precise, almost surgical conditions. First, it had to be too much to be retrieved by the hero. This meant the hero could not successfully deploy the sacrifice OS to save it through sheer willpower.
And second,
and this is just as important, it was not complete destruction of the system. The system could handle the aftermath without completely breaking the me persona or, initiating a deep trauma response. This was the exact maximum load where the me knew, undeniably, it could not sit in the driver's seat, but the processing of the aftermath still happened automatically.
This brings us to that profound idea of the failed miracle. If, in that week of doing nothing, some sudden deposit or outside help had intervened,
the me would have successfully defended its existence.
Right.
It would have reinforced its final defense line. See? My suffering and effort were justified. I still held the world together even at the last minute. That would have resulted in OS extension. It would have prolonged the old existence style.
So the death of the hero had to happen before the new autonomous world could be fully experienced.
It had to. The structure required the me to realize, I failed and I cannot intervene before the system could flip. The failure was the necessary precondition for the new structural reality.
Okay, let's revisit the physical fatigue now that we know the OS died. We're talking about immense tiredness after the crisis was settled days later. Why the delayed and immense physical toll?
Well, as we touched on, the primary cause is the cessation of personality drive. For years, the me was using the I and ZPF energy in this highly constrained, forced, unnatural way to drive the system like running a V8 engine on bicycle gears. When the me's handle was disconnected, the body instantaneously shifted out of its perpetual survival mode. It experienced a sudden, dramatic release of all that accumulated tension and trauma stored in the muscle memory and nervous system. The fatigue is the active, energy-intensive process of the nervous system rewiring and resynchronizing.
So the body isn't tired from running the old OS.
It's exhausted because it is finally standing down from the long war and repairing the damage.
Now, here's a complex concept that I think requires careful generalization for the listener. The subject realized that the crisis they saw, the looming numbers, the payments, the debt, was potentially an illusion, a phantom reality.
That's the nature of the old OS's final, desperate act. The crisis seen in those last week's numbers was likely the last past log referenced by a non-existent OS.
Like a blue screen of death.
It's a perfect equivalent. Your computer hits the blue screen and asserts, "I am still running and this danger is real. Look at the threat." The old world programming showed the subject the reality it wanted them to engage with. This is danger. Return. Deploy the hero OS.
But the core event was the me's definitive response.
Which was, "I will no longer support this." When the rendering source for that crisis reality was structurally cut off, the crisis itself began to dissolve into just a memory log.
The subject successfully declined the final invitation to play the old game.
Precisely. And this leads to the final rejection, which the source calls the unstoppable flag, that irreversible cognitive shift. If someone is suffering from burnout, they might say, "I need a break, but I might take back control next week." What's the difference between that tentative break and this new absolute state? The new state is absolute. It is non-negotiable. It is, "I'd rather break than take back control."
Wow.
That is the irreversible phase change. And it's not a death wish. It is the total structural rejection of the entire self-sacrificial existence style. The me realized, on an energetic and neurological level, that living under the old OS was fundamentally worse than the potential non-existence or loss of structure implied by the crisis. This moment is the concrete proof that the survival strategy successfully completed its mission by dismantling itself.
It realized the only way to truly survive was to stop being the one responsible for survival.
That's it.
Okay, so let's navigate this phase transition. The driver, the hero OS, is gone, but the user interface, the personality mechanism, is still, watching the dashboard with white knuckles. We see this residual anxiety surface, like in the internal conflict that appears during a shower dialogue, worrying about future payments, Amex, payroll.
The me has structurally relinquished the wheel, but it's still in this intense surveillance mode.
Hands off the wheel, but eyes fixed on the road.
Exactly. Eyes fixed, unblinking on the dashboard gauges and the road ahead. The me is watching for the crash it has been conditioned for decades to expect. The core logic of the me is still rooted in anticipating the worst and preparing reflexively to assume responsibility the second things go wrong.
And the subject deploys this brilliant, really powerful technique to silence this residual anxiety, the double-bind release.
It's so clever. The me's internal contradictory logic is always, "I'm not driving, but I'm still responsible for the accident." This is the foundational lie of the sacrificial hero. The subject breaks this bind by stating the new physical law of the I am inversion. Why are you worried if you are not in the driver's seat? Worrying is a mechanism of control and management. By asserting, if you don't sit in the driver's seat, you legally and structurally don't have the authority to worry, the me's role is just logically and structurally nullified.
It leads to silence.
Temporary but profound silence. You can't logically maintain responsibility without authority, and the me gave up its authority when the OS died.
And this principle is so essential for anyone dealing with, say, delegated tasks or organizational burnout. If you empower someone else, you have to structurally relinquish the authority to worry about their process.
You must. Worrying means you are attempting to exercise emotional control over a domain where you claim to have no physical authority. It's an internal contradiction that has to be exposed. And this brings us to that fantastic metaphor used in the sources.
The elderly taxi driver analogy.
For the me's nervous residue, yes, it's the perfect visualization. The me is the veteran, elderly taxi driver who spent 40 years navigating dangerous city streets, constantly overriding the system, constantly anticipating every possible threat. Now he's in a new self-driving car.
And he's physically unable to trust the algorithm.
He can't. The fear isn't a deep desire for control. It's a profound, conditioned responsibility reflex. The belief that if there is a crash, the UI, the instrument panel, the former driver, will ultimately be blamed. That neural firmware is still intensely active.
But the structural truth, which must provide immense, almost spiritual relief to the me, is that the era of the UI taking responsibility for accidents is over.
That is the ultimate liberating insight. The me is merely the instrument panel. The UI displays numbers, speed, fuel, potential error codes, but it does not determine the path.
And the me's anxiety will only truly fade as it gets more evidence.
Exactly. As repeated experiences of things moving forward without my intervention, what the source calls the future log, accumulate. These future logs, where the bills are somehow paid or the client issue resolves itself, they overwrite the decades of nervous cache that insists, if I don't act, everything collapses.
The me's needs irrefutable, repeated evidence that the autonomous system actually works.
It does. And until that cache is overwritten, the subject experiences these old cache symptoms, that lingering anxiety. The example given is checking email or reservations, seeing 0 bookings, and triggering the old fear-based simulator.
The simulator still runs automatically.
Oh, instantly. The MeOS is programmed to connect the dots. Current low numbers simulate future ruin, must act now to prevent failure. This prediction engine fires instantly, referencing that old cache of anxiety and failure logs.
But the critical change is...
What? The subject observes this old simulation, but no longer adds meaning to it. They are merely staring at the echoes of the old world. The driver isn't responding to the alert. The observer simply notes the screen flashing, recognizes the pattern, but doesn't engage the motor functions.
This brings us to the importance of physical acts during this transition, like the head spa the subject planned. It seems purely self-indulgent to go relax when you're facing an existential change, but the source frames it as vital maintenance.
It's functional maintenance, not indulgence. The head spa, or any deep physical rest, is an act of physically resynchronizing the vagus nerve toward the future log side. The me's defensive OS is strongest in the head and neck areas, the source of constant tension, analysis, and vigilance. So soothing these areas sends a physical, undeniable signal to the deeper nervous system.
The signal is, the war is over, stand down.
Exactly. It's a physical way to bypass the cognitive anxiety loop and reinforce the new structural reality.
Which leads to that powerful rule for this phase. Doing nothing is the strongest form of doing right now.
It absolutely is. Any impulsive action based on the old cash checking numbers compulsively, starting a new aggressive strategy, trying to chase new business, it risks instantly recaching the old log and reinforcing the defunct OS. The quiet state is essential. It's the necessary womb of new creation, allowing the new system to stabilize so the I-driven flow can begin.
And finally on this, the subject notes a pause in creative output. No YouTube, no social media posts. The previous motivation for creation was, as they put it, deficiency-driven.
Filling gaps in validation, addressing long silences out of strategic expectation, seeking approval.
So how will I-driven creation be fundamentally different?
I-driven creation won't come from a subjective push, like I want to do this to achieve X. It'll come from a recognition of external manifestation. It is already manifesting. The experience of creation will shift from effortful doing to spontaneous being.
So the subject will experience the action as, it started, and I am participating, rather than, I chose to start this, and I must see it through.
That's the shift. And this quiet phase is vital. It's the time when the old mechanisms of seeking recognition or proving worth are permanently detached from the creative impulse. It allows creation to flow freely without the burden of outcome.
Okay, for our final section, to really solidify the me's departure, the subject reflected deeply on a historical analogy they had been consuming.
The Three Kingdoms drama.
The relationship between the ultimate hero OS operator, the genius strategist Zhu Liang, or Kongming, and the relieved logistics officer Lian. This historical lens really helped the me understand its fate.
It summarizes the internal shift perfectly. Kongming and Lian were both entrusted by their lord, Liu Bei, with the ultimate responsibility, the continuation of the Shu kingdom. Lian failed spectacularly in his logistical duties and was ultimately exiled, stripped of his rank.
And the V had previously admired the heroes.
Of course. The successful pioneers, the unrelenting drivers like Cao Cao, and the one-man national operator Kong Ming. But now, post-collapse, the subject felt this deep, strange commonality with Leon. The official who failed and was exiled, and by doing so, escaped the impossible burden of running the nation.
So the me found its new identity not in the successful, burdened strategist, but in the disgraced man who finally got to quit.
Exactly. And the most illuminating moment comes from Kong Ming himself, the ultimate hero. Upon exiling Leon, he says, "Frankly, I envy Leon. I wish I could return to Nanyang and live out my life in the mountains."
Wow. That quote is the ultimate confession of the burdened soul.
It is.
It's the soul's desperate desire to leave the driver's seat, even if it meant ruin.
Kong Ming, who is the personification of the sacrificial hero OS, he knew the relentless burden would eventually destroy him. He envied Leon's forced freedom, his inability to bear the weight anymore, and the old me, the hero OS, had always believed that freedom came only with a terrible price. Social destruction and dishonor, like Leon's exile.
The critical point event was the moment the subject was forced to face that perceived price.
Yes, but the sources make a final, crucial distinction. The subject did not follow the Leon route.
And what's the difference?
This is the final structural lesson of the phase transition. Leon was disgraced, but he still remained within the world of status, military hierarchy, and evaluation. He was just at a lower, miserable rank. What happened to the subject was far more radical. The coordinate system itself vanished.
So there's no disgrace, no loss of standing.
No failure that even registers, because the axis of status, the hierarchy of success and failure, is gone. The subject didn't just quit the game and become disgraced. They became the observer outside the story.
Which brings us to the final structural conclusion. The entire financial crisis, the feeling of abandonment, the physical exhaustion, none of it was a failure.
No, it was a survival strategy successfully dismantling itself.
A necessary self-directed implosion.
The OS had reached the maximum possible capacity for self-sacrifice, and the only way to turn it off was to hit that critical point where intervention was physically and financially impossible. The subject is now in a state of phase transition, like liquid becoming gas. The internal pressure and tension are released. The density has fundamentally changed. And structurally, it is impossible to return to the original water.
The me might try to reassert its liquid form.
But the system has fundamentally transitioned to vapor.
The subject is no longer driven by the hero's vow to bear the world, but by the quiet realization that the burden has simply been lifted by the transition itself. The exhaustion will pass, the quietness will resolve into non-forced flow, and the world will just continue to run autonomously.
So what we've really witnessed here, through the detailed logs of this structural change, is a perfect illustration of how deep personal evolution is often masked by a material, seemingly devastating crisis. The sacrificial hero OS was the ultimate defense mechanism, using self-sacrifice to maintain control and identity.
And the financial critical point wasn't an accident or some kind of punishment. It was the necessary structural trigger.
Yeah.
It had to be a load too big for the hero to handle, but small enough not to destroy the underlying system. It forced the me to fully surrender the wheel.
And the subsequent UI's return to silence is the physical and psychological sign of true surrender and a successful transition.
The power of this IE model is that it provides a really technical framework for understanding common human experiences, like pervasive anxiety, burnout, the inability to delegate. It shows why trying harder sometimes doesn't solve the problem, but actually reinforces the old self-destructive system.
Especially if that system is rooted in that tenacious, self-righteous hero archetype.
So we'll leave you with the final provocative thought that's captured in the source material. The me, the former driver, found its deepest sense of security, not in success or safety, but in the structural realization. The UI is no longer responsible for the crash. If your entire existence was based on being the responsible driver, the hero who must constantly bear the world's weight, what is the first thing you will do when you realize you no longer have the authority to worry?
That first decision, that first action taken from a place of structural zero, not deficiency, is the true starting line for the new world. It might be taking a head spa or simply allowing a conversation to fall quiet. But whatever it is, that is the action that proves the hero is truly gone.